Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. Today I'm going to lecture over the last two classes of readings, chapters 4 through 7. I'm going to try and move pretty quickly and cover them somewhat superficially. My goal is going to be to raise a few questions and issues, but not really get into the nitty-gritty of the ethnography or the archaeology. And instead, I think it'll be more useful just to give a shorter PowerPoint and then let y'all talk about specific ethnographic and archaeological examples that you pulled out from the reading on your own. So in terms of the big picture issues that we're talking about here, this is just review, right? But the book is giving us a complex ethnography that represents the on-the-ground reality of border crossing from the perspectives of migrants. And of course, we're doing a lot of work thinking about how do migrants' realities depart from dominant discourses. And Jason de Leon is drawing on multiple perspectives, not just cultural anthropology or ethnography, but also forensics or biological anthropology, sociolinguistics, and archaeology. And through this kind of complex approach that really is about giving us a complex understanding of the richness of migrants' lives, he's raising some deep questions about structural violence and state power. How do nation-states govern the life and death of populations? And in particular, how do immigration policies create conditions that predispose certain kinds of persons to death? Even if when we're not talking about the active border agents actively killing undocumented migrants, we're talking about policies that create conditions in which certain groups are more likely to die. So we're talking about the systematic ways the state distributes life and death. And then the next piece, right, is how does the nation-state weaponize landscapes to carry out this violence? How does U.S. immigration policy rely on the desert as an environment that will enact violence against migrants so that state agents don't have to? And also just to review, right, we're going back over the 4 fields of anthropology, which include cultural anthropology, sociolinguistics, physical anthropology, and archaeology. And Jason de Leon is really going to draw on approaches from all 4 of these to give us, again, that rich perspective of migrants' lives, both in terms of structural violence, as well as I'm going to get to in a moment, humor and joy and friendship, trauma as well as joy. Because, that's how people live, right? That's what people's lives are. And so in previous chapters, right, in previous classes, we talked about the ways in which de Leon draws on forensic anthropology as a field within bioanthropology in order to better understand the kinds of violence enacted by the desert, including on the ways in which it erases bodies and stories of people after they've died. And of course, ethnography is playing a pretty major role in a way that I haven't explained so directly because it's, I think, a little obvious in the context of this class. But ethnography, of course, is a really important way in which Jason de Leon is trying to foreground migrants' own perspectives and realities. And in chapter 4, Jason de Leon talks a lot about sociolinguistics. And he starts thinking about the ways in which this perspective, a language-based perspective, helps us understand these kinds of underlying questions that he's concerned about. And so this chapter talks about a speech genre called chingaderas or pendejadas. And excuse my bad accent right there for that last one. But a speech genre, right, is in the same way a genre of music is a kind of style of music, a speech genre is a style of speech. It can be a knock-knock joke, it can be a rant, it can be I know there's more ways of talking than just ranting and joking and knock-knock jokes, but I guess I just don't use them. Oh, a lecture, that's another one. A lecture is a genre of speech. Thank God your professor is so creative in coming up with these examples. But anyway, right? So a chingada and a pendejada, these are both speech genres, and they're basically humorous stories. And Jason De Leon is interested in humorous stories about border crossing. And in his analysis, right, of this, right, he's talking about a kind of linguistic play, a language play, the ways in which people play around with each other using language. And this kind of way of talking serves many functions, right? Multiple functions. It does multiple things. On the one hand, it's very much tied to a working class Mexican identity and the ways in which participants construct their identity and their belonging within this kind of class and national context. It's also what Jason De Leon calls a weapon of the weak. It's a way in which very vulnerable people are able to articulate critiques of global hegemonic processes and resist those kinds of processes. So we could think of weapon of the weak as similar to the kinds of ways in which fundamentalist Christianities gave Matt Ray, in an earlier reading, tools for resisting these really violent processes of economic dispossession. But in this context, right, when we talk about humorous stories as a weapon of the weak, what we're talking about is the kinds of social tools and adaptions and linguistic tools that people use in order to survive really violent conditions, right? How do you survive in the context of this kind of trauma and violence? How do you build good relationships with other people as a social being in these contexts? And so here Jason De Leon makes the important point, right, that these speech genres, they're not just about a kind of working class Mexican identity, whatever that means, or Mexican working class culture, I should say, but also these larger systems of immigration policy and capitalism. And it's a way in which undocumented migrants can engage in and understand and critique and problematize and work through these contradictions of immigration and capital. And of course, the last piece, right, is that these ways of talking signal confianza and respeto, meaning, right, they are a way of communicating, hey, we're good, like we're friends, we understand each other, we're on good terms, we can joke with each other because we're friends. So, coming back around, right, these kinds of language genres, humorous stories about border crossings, do multiple things. They are weapons of the weak, they help people construct identity, and they help people manage, or negotiate, I should say, really personal social relationships and interactions, right? So we see the big picture of how do these ways of speaking relate to broader global power relationships, and the really fine-grained micro level. How is it about mediating your relationship with the person you're talking to? As a friend, as a confidant. And the point that Jason De Leon makes in his analysis of the way migrants tell stories is that we're not just talking about worlds of structural violence in terms of tragedy and pain and trauma. Of course, that stuff is very real, but the way people survive is through humor and joy and friendship. And these stories let people do that. They let people deal with these really violent conditions in a way that is about surviving, that is about building friendships and confidence, or confidence, I guess you would say, not confidence. And this is just, I really love this point in the book, right? And if you think about the way border crosses are often represented in the news, they're represented as very serious. They're not funny, they're not humorous or ironic, they're tragic, right? And I'm sure every story you've read in the news about border crossing has been tragic. And, it's not that tragedy is incorrect, but at the same time, Jason De Leon is saying if we actually look at migrant people's actual perspectives, they're just really fucking funny. They're making jokes about this. Sure, it's dark humor, but I guess what I'm saying, right, is we don't live in worlds of pure suffering and trauma. We also find ways of finding joy within these really dark places. And that's such an important ethnographic insight that gives us such a richer perspective of migrants' lives and their perspectives. Now, he also has this other point, which is a little more straightforward and smaller, but it is worth mentioning. Spending money on border enforcement does not work. It does not stop people from migrating. What has worked has been political economic factors like the 2008 crash, where there was a dip in migration, undocumented migration, because the U.S. was doing really bad and it didn't make sense to migrate there anymore. So that's the best way to forestall undocumented migration, I guess. Anyway, sorry, that was a bad joke right there, speaking of dark humor and irony, but just run with it, please. So Jason De Leon also is looking at archaeology and how archaeology can illuminate migrants' lives in the migration process. And this is honestly one of my favorite chapters in the book, and one of the reasons why I assigned this book in the first place. Because we often think about archaeology in terms of studying past peoples, and Jason De Leon is saying, hey, we can actually use these tools to understand migrant crossings in the desert, whether it's from 10 years ago or a few days ago. And so looking at the very recent and contemporary past that shapes our world in terms of migrant people's histories, or contemporary histories, as he would say. Now, there's a couple reasons why he thinks archaeology is especially useful, right? On the one hand, migrants don't really like talking about their experiences crossing borders. Oftentimes. Now, some of the folks that Jason De Leon talks to told him stories about that, but often other people didn't. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it, right? Because border crossing is traumatic. That's the whole point. And people don't like talking about traumatic memories. And if they do talk about it years later, they may misremember things because it was a long time ago, or just because, again, it was traumatic. And so for De Leon, this archaeology provides a way of understanding these experiences and processes through material culture, and understanding things that people really don't necessarily want to articulate in terms of their own personal experiences and rehashing that trauma. But the other piece, right, is you have these anti-immigration ideologies in which right-wingers decry what they call migrant trash, or the litter left in the desert as a result of undocumented migration. And the idea here is that this litter poses multiple problems. It is an environmental problem that is an issue with, it's an environmental problem. It's also considered to be a problem in terms of the protection of sacred sites and historical sites, right, by leaving all of this litter around. And Jason De Leon illustrates this with a quote that he pulls from the comments section of a news article. And this is why I have my shark friend who reminds you, never read the comments section. But this person posted, Mexico is a dump, and they turn anywhere they go into a dump, right? The idea being that undocumented migrants are turning the desert into a dump by leaving all this trash, and they're turning these wondrous American hardworking communities into dumps as well. Now, on the one hand, this is just some rando racist on the internet, but on the other hand, it is an example that's really illustrative of this broader discourse of migrant trash that frames migrants as dirty, as leaving trash, as posing problems posing problems on the one hand in terms of again, litter, but also just associating undocumented migrants with like dirtiness and trash. And Jason DeLeon's point is that in contrast to this discourse of migrant trash, the reality is more complicated. Many of the objects that DeLeon encounters were not things that were meant to be left behind. They were things like Bibles, family photos, and love letters, as well as, of course, things that were cans or other kinds of refuse that were disposed of. But alternatively, people also drop things because they're too exhausted to carry them further. They may be running from border patrol and have to drop their things to get out and escape. There's all kinds of reasons for why people might leave things in any particular area or any particular place. He also is able to look at these objects and say, hey, look, we can see through this shoe that's been totally destroyed. We can understand that somebody was walking through the desert and was in intense pain. Or we can see a shoe, he has the example of the shoe that's been fixed with a bra strap, right? As a kind of ad hoc means of preserving your feet while you make this really arduous journey, right? And he sees this material culture that does index pain and suffering as well as adaptation. And it does teach us something about migrants' lives and their experiences crossing. He also points out, right, border control agents tend to frame these kinds of sites that he's looking at, these migrant sites, through a single kind of word that I've lost in my notes, layups, right? The border control calls all of these places layups. The idea being they're places where migrants lay up for a period of time. But through the archaeology, Jason DeLeon says, actually, there's many different kinds of sites that people use in different ways. There are campsites where people might spend the night. There's rest sites where people might spend maybe an hour or a few hours resting, eating food, recovering. There's pickup sites, places where people wait to be picked up once they get into the United States. And those tend to be places with a pretty high material signature because people tend to leave a lot of stuff there because they've made it through the desert and they don't need it there. And as you get multiple parties of people coming through and getting picked up at the same site, right, you have an accumulation. But you also have things like religious shrines, places where people worship while they're in the desert. You have border staging areas, places where people wait, sometimes for several days to a week or more, waiting for an opportunity to cross the border. And you have apprehension sites, places where the border patrol comes and people just drop everything they have and run. Now, going back to this question, right, like, why do people drop the things they drop, right? Sometimes I said that people may drop things because they're just so exhausted they can't carry it anymore. And so people, sometimes people even drop perfectly good food because what they can carry at that point is their water, and that's the most important thing. And so when we talk about these material signatures as trash or layup sites, we lose track of this much more complicated reality of migration. And this raises a really important point, right? If these conservative or dominant anti-immigration discourses decry migrant trash as, again, an environmental problem and a historical preservation problem, the point that Jason DeLeon makes is, so why don't migrants' histories matter? Why don't their material record matter? Why are the material traces that they leave not considered worth preserving in order to be able to tell these kinds of stories? And part of this, as he points out, has to do with federal policy, which does define historic materials as more than 50 years old. So this literally does not fit into that definition of history. or the kinds of legal structures that define what is worth preserving and what's not. But this idea of trash, again, migrant trash, really what it does is it takes this material presence and basically says it devalues it. It's very ethnocentric. And it presumes that the histories of migrants crossing the border is not worth preserving. So as always, feel free to post in the discussion. If you have something you really are burning to talk about that's not on this question list, go for it. But post about that. I love it. But if you need more structure, use these questions.